Okay, so there are a number of different ways to think through the ethics of sex and relationships. So let's have a look at the conservative approaches, which include Kantian ethics and natural law. Saint Augustine is a key conservative thinker on sex and relationships, and he would argue that lust can be a destructive force. And when we hear the word lust these days, perhaps it sounds a very old-fashioned word. It's not the kind of word that we tend to use every day. And maybe the idea that lust is destructive seems somewhat pessimistic. But I think it's definitely worth bearing in mind this idea of St. Augustine. So if we think of President Clinton, for instance, who was the former US president, and he had an affair with an intern, Monica Lewinsky, and all of the ramifications that followed from that are just an indication of how strong sexual desire can be and how it can make people risk everything. So here you have the most powerful person in the world risking so much in pursuit of sexual desire. So even if we don't want to see this as a complete truth, it's certainly a partial truth there, the potentially destructive nature of lust or of sexual desire. This leads St. Augustine to say sex is only permissible within marriage and for the purpose of procreation. So you can see this potentially destructive force that needs to be channeled in these particular ways. So Augustine would argue that free expression of sexual desire leads to the subjection of the spirit to the flesh in a sordid servitude. So there's a sort of dualistic view here that we're divided in two. We have the spiritual side of us, the higher part of us, and the flesh, the lower part of us. And in the free expression of sexual desire, it's the flesh that's in control. And that's what St. Augustine would see as sinful. Kant is another conservative thinker about sex and relationships, and he would argue that sexuality can inevitably involve using another human being as a means to satisfying one's desire. So because of that, he would argue the pursuit of sexual pleasure is only acceptable when it's subordinated to a higher goal, such as marriage. So here is a quotation that really sums up Kant's views on sexuality. If a man wishes to satisfy his desire and a woman hers, they stimulate each other's desire. Their inclinations meet, but their object is not human nature, but sex, and each of them dishonours the human nature of the other. They make humanity an instrument for the satisfaction of their lusts and inclinations, and dishonour it by placing it on a level with animal nature. So here we can see an application of the second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. And if you remember, this is that it argues that it's wrong to use someone simply as a means to an end. It's wrong to use someone else as a thing or an object simply to get what we want. And this clearly can happen in sexual relationships. According to Kant, this doesn't happen when sex is subordinated to a higher goal, such as marriage. So Kant's view would rule out a person telling someone else that they love them simply in order to have sex. So that kind of manipulative behaviour is clearly an example of someone using someone else as a means to an end, of someone manipulating somebody. It would also clearly see prostitution as wrong, because again, that's another case where one person is being used for the gratification of another. One person's being used simply as a means to an end. A criticism of Kant would be to acknowledge that he's right to say people can be manipulative in their sexual relationships. It's clearly a danger in relationships that people begin to treat others as objects in that way. But the idea that this is somehow inevitable in sex before or sex outside marriage is certainly, I think, a questionable part of Kant's theory. And perhaps Kant and Augustine can be accused of beginning with a negative view of sexuality. So they begin with a kind of pessimistic view of the nature of sex, and this colours their views on the ethics of sex and relationships. Another approach, which broadly speaking can be called conservative, is the natural law approach. This is the approach that's rooted in the ideas of Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, and has influenced the Catholic tradition. And for Aquinas, there are these three purposes of sex: procreation, pleasure, and unification of the couple, a means of expressing love and binding the couple together. And it's interesting to note here that pleasure and unification are there alongside procreation. So many people know, according to this tradition, a key purpose of sex is procreation, but also within the tradition, this acknowledgement of these other purposes. From this starting point, it's argued that sexual behavior that doesn't meet these purposes is unnatural and therefore not in accordance with God's purposes. So once we've got an idea of the purpose of sex, then what doesn't fit those purposes is clearly identified. So it follows from this that sexual acts are seen to be wrong in two ways. So the act of its nature is incompatible with the purpose of the sex act. In other words, some kind of sexual behavior that doesn't lead to procreation. So this could include masturbation, bestiality, homosexuality, or what could be broadly categorized as deviance. In addition to that, acts which conflict with right reason may arise from the nature of the act with respect to the other party. So this is some quite complicated wording, but what it's really saying is even if the sexual behavior can lead to procreation, there are many other ways in which it may be unethical. So incest, rape, seduction, adultery, these behaviors can clearly lead to procreation, but they're definitely not seen as ethical within this tradition. So just thinking of some criticisms of the natural law approach, our views on sexual ethics should be based around the concepts of harm, consent and love, arguably. So the whole idea of thinking about God's purposes or what's natural may be seen as irrelevant. Interestingly too, this emphasis that there might be more purposes of sex and reproduction, the more that's taken seriously, the purpose of sex for pleasure, the purpose of sex for intimacy, the purpose of sex to express love and bind a couple together, then some of the things that natural law rules out, like the use of contraception, like homosexual relationships, could be seen in a quite different light. So the liberal Catholic psychologist Jack Dominion is one of the theorists who offers a wider view of the purposes of sex. So the less emphasis is given to the procreative purpose, then the greater the possibility there is for rethinking this tradition's view on the ethics of sex and relationships.